Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute's webinar on the Mood of Americans that we are recording on January the 25th. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. Americans go to the polls in 284 days. With the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire primary behind us, analysts say it seems likely to once again pit President Joe Biden against former President Donald Trump. While the focus is always on the presidency, these elections also involve all 435 members of the House of Representatives, 1/3 of the 100-member Senate, 11 governors, local and county legislators, as well as various referendum measures. Speaking at the cabinet retreat earlier this week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that because Canada-U.S. relations are fundamental for the prosperity and well-being of Canadians, he is tasking Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Trade Minister Mary Ng to work with Ambassador Kirsten Hillman on a, quote, Team Canada approach, unquote, with, quote, businesses, entrepreneurs, organized labor, civil society groups, different orders of government, to make sure that we're ready to continue to benefit as Canadians from a strong relationship with the United States. To help us situate the issues and attitudes of Americans, I'm delighted to welcome back our presenter, Bruce Stokes. Bruce is Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We've all benefited from Bruce's previous presentations. To discuss what this all means for Canadians, I welcome back our commentators, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. Louise is Senior Advisor to the Business Council of Canada. A career Foreign Service officer, she served as our Consul General to Atlanta and as Ambassador to the United Nations. Gary and David both served as Canada's Ambassador to the United States. Gary through much of the Obama administration and David through the end of Obama and then the Trump years. Gary also served as Manitoba Premier for a decade. Both Gary and David serve on the CJAI Advisory Council. As to procedure, Bruce will present his slides for 20 or so minutes. Then Louise, David, and Gary will comment on the presentation and what it means for Canada. I'll ask a couple of questions, then our producer, Joe Calnan, will pose your questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and use it anytime you like because Joe will be monitoring it. With that, Bruce, over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with everyone, especially with our esteemed panel. We've done this a couple of times, as you said before, and I've always learned so much from people's comments and observations, and we look forward to also the questions, which I find the most interesting because you want to know what people think, and you can know that from their questions. So let me briefly run through recent public opinion of the American people about what they're worried about, some of the foreign policy issues that they're worried about, and also what we kind of know 280 days before the election. I don't want to overemphasize that because a lot of things can happen in 288 days. But at this point, let me just start sharing some of these slides that we have. The mood is solidifying, I would say. If you look at the overall mood of the electorate, you can see that there's really very high pessimism about the future. This is something that's been going on for some time. And you can see that it actually is something that you see in other data as well. When you ask people about the direction of the country, they're also very negative about the direction of the country. But again, that has been the case for many years. So there's a broader issue here at stake, not just about how people feel immediately about the country and about the future, but the high point of people feeling the country was going in the right direction was in the early 1960s. And while it's bounced around over time, it's been the trend line has been down. So there's something more fundamental going on in American public opinion, which we don't have a whole lot of time to parse out right now. But I think people have to understand the context is Americans have been fairly negative about the country's direction and by extension, its future for some time, irregardless of the administration. When you ask people what the most important problems facing the country are, it's economics, followed by immigration and the state of democracy. Notably, by almost 2-to-1, people believe the economy is bad. Now, this is not supported by the data. The data is pretty clear. The economy is doing very, very well. The stock market's at record highs. Unemployment is very low. Inflation is going down. But this is what people think. And notably, they don't believe their incomes are keeping up with inflation, even though overall wages are rising faster than inflation. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean every person's wages are rising faster than inflation, but there's this general negativity that is a byproduct and a residue of the high inflation we experienced immediately after the COVID pandemic. And that perception has not caught up with reality. Obviously, the Biden administration hopes it will, because right now people feel fairly negative about the economy. There's also a curious thing going on in the public, and it's been here for a while. When you ask people about their personal financial situation, they're pretty ebullient about it. Nearly 8 in 10 say my personal financial situation is doing pretty well. But only a quarter say that the national economy is doing well. And as you can see, in recent years, actually, that disconnect has gotten greater. This disconnect is also highly partisan. As you can see, Republican views of the economy have fluctuated more sharply than Democratic views. But when a Democrat is in power, the Democrats tend to feel good about the economy. When a Republican is in power, Republicans seem to feel good about the economy. And so when you ask people about their sense of the economy, it's not at all clear whether they're talking about the economy or they're just talking about whether their guy is in the White House or someone else. Consumer sentiment is rebounding, and there is, just in the last couple of weeks, a sense that possibly we've turned and public perceptions of the economy are improving. As you can see in this University of Michigan Index, the consumer survey, you have a sense of good feeling about the economy and about personal consumer sentiment that is as high as it has been back in the Obama administration, after reaching a real low point in the first couple of years of the Biden administration. But just to add a note to that, the consumer sentiment was much higher during the Trump administration. And this may be, to go back to that for 1 second, this may be why when Trump says that things were better under him, and we ask, why do people remember that? This consumer sentiment may be what they're remembering, that they've actually just felt better about the economy. Whether they were actually better or not is a different story. But another reason why there is such partisan negativity about the economy is that only 1 in 5 Democrats report hearing bad news about the economy. But those are people who tend to listen to MSNBC and CNN, whereas Fox News viewers, who are overwhelmingly Republican, say they hear mostly bad news about the economy. And we're all consumers of news. And if you're fed a series of stories about how bad the economy is and not good news, the good news that came out today, that last year in 2023, the economy grew by 3.1%, which is fairly good and much higher than in Europe, for example. But if you are fed bad news about the economy, you're going to believe it. An interesting development here, though, is that it's not only a difference in people's perceptions of the economy and how it's affecting them, and the national economy is horrible, but my personal finances are okay. If you ask people in America about almost anything, they're more likely to say, my personal situation is pretty good, and the country is really bad, including things like their romantic life. They say, my romantic life is good, but the country's romantic life is bad. And access to healthcare, mental health, educational opportunities, almost every concern of the American public, people feel better, but this doesn't necessarily translate into them actually then feeling good about the current administration. And it's one of the things that candidate Trump has honed in on, that things are horrible in general. And people say, well, yeah, things are okay with me, but the country's basket. And one of those issues, a very strong issue for Trump, is immigration, and for Republicans. And reporting just today was that there's a good chance there will be no immigration reform coming out of the Congress this year. And I think folks like me, who believe that immigration is actually good for the country, have to acknowledge that we've had unprecedentedly high levels of immigration, and that we are now at about 13 to 14% of the population is foreign born. We've only had that experience twice in the past, in the 1880s and the 1920s. And in both cases, there was a populist backlash. And I think that what we're experiencing now is a populist immigration, and it has political consequences, because just reported today, Donald Trump is supposedly calling members of the Senate and telling them, don't do an immigration reform. I want to run on this issue, just as I did in 2016. So he sees to his advantage not to fix this problem. This focus on immigration has led to particularly ugly views about immigrants themselves. Trump has said repeatedly on the campaign trail that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, and 3/4 of Republicans agree with him. This, of course, was said, been married to 2 different immigrants and fathered children with 2 different immigrants, but it doesn't seem to have affected his view or their view of him. Now, the public is also worried about the future of democracy. This is something that the Biden administration is emphasizing. You can see people are strongly concerned about the future of the democracy. And I want to thank you very much. A Canadian poll that was just out last week showed that Democrats are very concerned about American democracy, which is probably you should be. But what is, I think we need to acknowledge, is that when people say they're worried about democracy, that doesn't mean they share the same concerns that the Biden administration says they have. There are a number of people, it would appear 46% of Republicans, who are worried about democracy and say, well, we have this democratic problem in the United States, the small d problem in the United States, and we need an authoritarian to run the country. And I think that is one of the themes that Trump will be pursuing, which he has begun to say in his campaign, that he's not a threat to democracy, Biden is a threat to democracy. And he's trying to capture that issue from Biden. Very briefly, on foreign policy issues that are affecting the electorate, Americans are divided about Biden's handling of the Gaza war. Nearly 4 in 10 have no opinion, which I find fascinating. Now, this was an early December poll, but it's some of the most recent polling on this issue, which suggests that people are far less focused on the Gaza war than, say, elites are. Many of the people on this podcast, for example. But I think that we have to acknowledge that it is not as much of a priority as we might think. Foreign policy issues have never been a huge issue in American, rarely been a huge issue in American elections. It is notable that Democrats, by almost 4-1, are more likely than Republicans to say Israel is going too far, which adds pressure on the Biden administration to pressure the Netanyahu government to end the war. One of the issues that Biden will be facing around this issue, to the extent that people are focusing on it, is that the young and the middle-aged are more likely to say Biden is favoring Israel too much. I would note in passing that it is young people in the United States who have increasingly over time been favoring the Palestinians, even before the Gaza war. And there is, I think, from an Israeli point of view, a danger that that generation, if it continues to hold these views, being more supportive of the Palestinians than Israel, that the Gaza war will only accentuate that. And this is the next generation of American. So I think the Israeli government needs to pay attention to that. There's disapproval also of Biden's handling of Ukraine. 6 in 10 Democrats approve, but 6 in 10 Republicans don't approve of his handling of Ukraine. The reporting out today is that the Republicans are increasingly wary of passing more Ukrainian aid, in part because of the immigration issues. But separate from that, it's not clear that you get Ukrainian aid without immigration reform. And what they're hearing from their voters is that we're doing too much. As you can see here, the percentage of folks that say we're doing too much and the partisan difference on that perception of we're doing too much for Ukraine has gone from 4 points partisan difference, basically no difference, at the beginning of the war, to a 32 percentage point difference on Ukraine aid today. Finally, the horse race. Biden, historically unpopular. No incumbent president in modern times has had such a low approval rating in December before his re-election year. But the race is effectively tied. You will see on almost a daily basis different polls showing Trump ahead or possibly Biden ahead. The most recent New York Times poll showed Biden ahead. But I think we have to assume it is tied. But as I said, it's about 280 days until the election. Most people are not really focused on this. Be very wary of polls that try to make a projection. Be very wary of polls that just poll all voters, which are all Americans, which I think is what you would do at this time of the election cycle. But the really important questions are when you ask registered voters and then when you get closer to the election, likely voters, people who have actually voted in the past, then you get a better sense of what the outcome might be. It is notable that not only does the public think the economy is doing poorly when it's not, but people believe they were economically better off under Trump than under Biden. The public feels that they can trust Biden more than Trump, but they think that Biden lacks the mental sharpness and physical health to be effective. I think we have to acknowledge that Biden can come off in public at times as a bit hesitant, tottering a bit. Trump increasingly comes off as a bit disconnected. There's this viral moment when he confused Nikki Haley with Nancy Pelosi. And so we'll see whether the sense that Trump has the mental sharpness and physical health to be effective. Maybe that sentiment changes over time. We just don't know. But right now, I think we have to acknowledge that Trump comes off as much more vigorous in public and in interviews than does Biden, who seems more hesitant. And people associate that hesitancy with age. As we get closer to the election, Biden's success is going to depend on reinvigorating support among non-whites, the young, and the poor. It's a little bit hard to read this, but I'll just read out some of these numbers. 55% of people who made less than $50,000 a year say they voted for Biden in the 2020 exit polls. His support among that group today is only 46%. So that's a 9 percentage point drop. They've got to fix that. Similarly, 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds say they voted for Biden immediately after the election. They said this in exit polls. Now only 39% support Biden. That's a huge drop. So Biden has his work cut out for him in mobilizing those voters. A couple final slides. One thing we should be acknowledge, and you folks are much better at controlling spending in elections than we are. This political spending is estimated in this upcoming election year to be 5 times greater in 2024 than in 2012. These really are the best election money can buy in the United States. And as you can see, it's not at all clear where this spending ends going forward. I think 2 things about the election once it's over that we have to accept. The legitimacy divide is not going to end. Even if Trump wins, there will be this sense that among Democrats that it wasn't a legitimate election. If Biden wins, certainly Trump is already laying the groundwork for that assertion in his speeches that it won't be a legitimate election. And finally, and to my mind, one of the more disconcerting things about recent American electoral history is that the most likely outcome is divided government, that there will be potentially, in this case, I think people assume the Democrats will regain control of the House, the Republicans will regain control of the Senate, and we don't know who's going to win the White House. But that's divided government. It's a prescription for stalemate. In 5 of the last 5 elections, we've had divided government. And in 10 of the last 12 elections, we've ended up with divided government. The public likes divided government. Whether that leads to effective government is a totally different question. And with that, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. That was, as always, just terrific. Sobering, but it is important that we understand the lay of the land. And it's what the Prime Minister and his cabinet and others will be looking at. Let me turn to Gary, because he spent much of his career looking at polling and certainly understands what politics is about. What are your takeaways, Gary?
Well, I really enjoyed Bruce's presentation again. I do believe there's a lag between what happens in the economy in a positive way or negative way to what people feel. And I think coming into the 2024 year, Joe Biden, who's always undervalued in terms of predictability, he's always underestimated. He's got the Michigan numbers that Bruce talked about in terms of consumer opinion. He's got inflation down. He's got the GDP up. He's got employment up. This is not a bad way to start the year, 6 or 7 months out from when people actually vote. Secondly, I agree with Bruce on a divided government. I think the Senate will change to the Republicans. Of course, you've got somebody like Mitch McConnell as their leader. He's a very competent man. He's a very intelligent leader. He's good to work with, both in terms of his own caucus and also in terms of countries like Canada. I do think the House will go back to the Democrats. The chaos in the House and the short margin between the two parties, I think there will be changes in seats in New York and California and other places. and some of the redistricting will also help. So I do agree that there will be divided government, but the Senate will go Republican and the House will go Democrat. That will be my prediction. But I would say that Biden's going out, the swing states. Biden got a big endorsement from the auto workers yesterday in Michigan. They have members in some other parts of the swing states, the Great Lakes states. He's in Wisconsin today. I think he's got to get rid of that jargon, Biden economics or whatever it is, and get on to much more tangible kinds of language with people and tangible language that deals with the economic improvements. I do think the border is his biggest problem. We're a little smug in Canada. We don't have many people going from Greenland to Nunavut to Canada. We've had some problems on the Manitoba border, the Quebec border, but the problems at the Mexican border are huge. They've got to get more buy-in from the Mexican government. I know they're trying to do that, but if they get Biden, notwithstanding Trump's interference in getting a solution to this, has got to get some of his own ownership of dealing with this issue in a more tangible way. And the old, in former days, it affected the southern states a lot, but now with the tawdry busing of people to places like a lot of the states that now are held by Democrats, that's very much complicating the emotion on the border and Biden's position or lack of results on it. I think that's just a huge vulnerability. If I was Biden also, I'd run a steady Eddie and, talking about Trump with the dictator in North Korea and Putin and others, and I have lots of films about that. The public may not be reflecting concern about international issues, but there's so much news, whether it's in the Middle East, the Houthis, the threats of North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. He's steady hands on the wheel, and he should campaign on that, even though he is older than Trump and looks older. But I think he should go with that great experience. I think they're not using that enough. Those are my comments. I really enjoyed Bruce's presentation.
Well, thanks, Gary. Louise, you and I both spent our career writing reports back to Ottawa from the field. What would be the headline on your report back to Ottawa after seeing Bruce's presentation and just your own feel of things?
Well, thanks you, Colin. Indeed. And Bruce, again, fantastic presentation and spot on. And I was in the Southeast United States, really MAGA territory when I was there. So I tended to hear a lot from them and how they're thinking. And it looks as if that's just not much has changed, in sort of the positioning. And January 6th didn't seem to have really, there was a little bit of a time there after January 6th and after the 2022 midterms where Trump kind of looked like he was over the hill, no longer the right man to lead the Republicans for a variety of reasons, some of which his own personal flaws and then others having to do with his inability to rally winners because he really put his name on candidates that really didn't get elected in 22 and they didn't do as well in the Congress as they had thought. And now fast forward 2 years and we find ourselves in the place we're in where the mood of the country is as you described, Bruce, and it seems that the never Trump again Republicans are back in this camp with a vengeance. And we're seeing this play out in the primaries, obviously. I think what we have to I think we can pretty much surmise from your presentation and following the news is that this is going to be another really close election. I mean, in both the last election, both the one that Trump won in 2016 and the one that Biden won in 2020, it was really about 100,000 votes. It's 80 to 100,000 votes in very specific states. For Biden, it was Nevada, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. And for Donald Trump, before that, it was Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Michigan. So it just these handful, technically a number of votes just swayed the balance. So I think we're in that, we're in that territory again. And one of the things that wasn't in your presentation, Bruce, but to add to this is the fact that really the 90 plus indictments that the former president is under has absolutely not hurt him. If anything, it's helped him. We have very little reason to believe that even if some of the judgments came in before November, even if they went against him, that he was found guilty of something, there's very little indication that that would change things. I think people have decided to just not distrust the system or to overlook it because of their pocketbook. And at the end of the day, that's what people vote on, is money in their pocket. And for a lot of people, the Republicans represent fiscal, whether it's true or not, that's debatable, but fiscal responsibility, less taxes, and that it will not change with this election. And I think I agree with your assessment, Bruce, at the end when you say absolutely the Senate is likely to go back to Republican. There's 10 toss-up states that are really for the Democrats will probably lose enough of them to make the difference. And I think most predictions are that that the House will go back. I think maybe I'll just end with this. Maybe that's a silver lining for Canada in all of this, is that we will have a divided government. It may not be good for Americans, Bruce, but I think for us, it's probably a bit of an insurance policy that will keep things in check. And so any excesses of either side. So I'll end with that. Thank you, Colin. Thanks,
Louise. David, over to you. You've been advising ministers, premiers, prime ministers, business leadership. Anna, you're a superb analyst. You've seen this polling. What's your sort of takeaways from what Bruce has presented to us today?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating presentation, and thanks again, Bruce. But I guess the most disturbing number that I saw in all of that was the fact that 34% of the American population thinks the answer to whatever problem we face at the present moment is essentially to have a dictator, to not allow Congress and the courts to interfere with the decisions that a president would make. And that is so in conflict with the fundamental underpinning of the U.S. Constitution that it shocks me. And I guess, looking forward, if you can envisage what everybody's been talking about here, which is again a divided Congress with perhaps the Republicans having the Senate and the Democrats having the House, that kind of mood of frustration of things not happening and things not getting done and everything else is likely to increase. And so, I think it's a worrying number. The other thing I would just say to Canadians is that, there's no question that the focus of the focus of Trump and Republicans and the administration is on the southern border. That increasingly we've heard complaints about the northern border. I mean, when I was in Washington, I worked very closely with Representative Elise Stefanik, and who borders Lake Ontario, her district does. And what she was really keen on and what we worked on together was loosening some of the restrictions about going back and forth across the border. We were talking about a frequent voters program, so people could actually go over to Canada for dinner or vice versa and everything else. And in the last month, when she was up campaigning for Trump or in New Hampshire, she was citing the problems of migration from the northern border. And so I think it's a worry. Obviously, it would cause huge problems if there was some kind of a terrorist event in the United States and the perpetrators were seen to have come from Canada. And so I think, this isn't just a Mexico issue. It is actually a reflection of, I think, what is an increasing sort of isolationism and protectionism in the United States. And I think the worrisome, from an electoral point of view, the auto workers supporting Biden is obviously a good thing for his prospects. I think what you're going to see is that Biden will be trying to enlist as many as much labor support as he can possibly get over the next, 288 days or whatever it is. And some of the demands that those labor union leaders will make will not be in Canada's interest. So I think we face an enormous challenge. I worry about, the state of American democracy, and I think it goes beyond simply, MAGA and Trump. I think we've got there's an underlying concern there, which there's not much we can do about it, and we can't preach to the Americans or wag our fingers or anything like that. But we should be aware that our open access to the U.S. Economy and to the movement of people and goods and services is not guaranteed, and there's lots of underlying things here that could cause us problems, not just in the review of the CUSMA agreement and all that kind of stuff, but just in terms of our relationship with the United States. And so one of the things I clearly would like to see us do more of is to identify some of the big issues that Americans are worried about, the administration and others, Congress are worried about, and see how it is that we can, be seen more to be supportive as allies, as friends, and as neighbors, and whether that be in the migration of people, or whether that be in drugs coming across the border, or whatever it is. We've got to pay attention to their needs, particularly over the next couple of years, and we need to be seen as being a reliable, trusted ally and friend if we're going to preserve the kind of access we have at the present moment.
As always, good advice, David. Bruce, the 34% figure truly is troubling. And I was in touch with our friend John Manley last night, and he said, ask the question, are American institutions up to Trump too?
It's a very good question. And I think that, if you work through the various institutions, and it's not at all clear what he meant by, are they up to Trump too? Is that, are the institutions there to kind of give it some discipline and some order and some structure, or are the institutions more likely to go along with Trump? But I think it depends on the institution. I think the Supreme Court, given its conservative decisions in the past and its conservative makeup, I would be shocked, except in the very extreme things that Trump might do, I would be shocked if the Supreme Court tried to discipline him or oppose him. The Congress, it'll depend. I mean, as Mitch McConnell has said just in the last couple of days to his Republican colleagues in the Senate, this is the best immigration chance we have, because if the Democrats if they lose control of the Senate and we gain control, you still need 60 votes in the Senate to do anything in a Trump administration on immigration. And you're not going to get that. You're not going to get 60 votes because the Republicans won't have 60 votes in the Senate. And if the Democrats take control of the House, then you're not going to get immigration reform out of the House. So I think Congress will be unlikely to be either terribly supportive of what Trump might do, but also probably won't be able to stand much in the way. And I think what you'll get is more executive orders by the Trump administration, just as you're getting more and more executive orders by the administration. We are on a slow ascent here in America of government by executive order. And the courts in the early days of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and some of its actions, whether the courts will continue to act as some kind of, the lower courts especially, some control over executive orders by a second Trump administration, it's hard to say. history suggests maybe. Trump has already promised to try to gut the federal bureaucracy, get rid of a lot of career people, put more political people in. It's, again, that would be challenged in the courts. If he's successful at that, then the deep state, what he calls the deep state, I would call it just the career bureaucrats, won't be around to try to discipline him. And I think we are likely to see a second Trump administration in which Trump surrounds himself not with adults, as he did at least at the beginning of his administration the first time, people who'd been around, had vast experience, and tried to keep him from doing some more extreme things. I think the lesson he learned is, I'm only going to surround myself in a second administration with yes men. And that, I think, is something we need to be very concerned about going forward.
Can I just jump in there, Colin?
Please go ahead, Louise.
Just to say, absolutely. And Bruce, just to add to that list, I think the DOJ, if I was a bureaucrat in the DOJ fairly high up, I'd worry about my pension and my career, because I think he's going to go really deep into the DOJ. And unfortunately, the Department of Justice is obviously, I mean, it's a little bit of the névralgique, as we say en français, when it comes to management of a democracy.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Louise, stay with me. As I talked about the Prime Minister having asked ministers to lead the Team Canada approach, given your experience, and I'm going to ask both David and Gary to come in on this as well, what advice would you offer to Minister Champagne and Ng as they start this Team Canada outreach campaign?
Oh, just two? I have my own list here. No, I'll be very brief on this. The first one, be careful with the rhetoric in Canada. I think we're seeing too much of the negative Republican rhetoric. I think that's dangerous. I think even if Trump doesn't get in the White House, we're looking at a GOP governed Senate. They pay attention, they notice. So that's dangerous. I'd say stop that. Focus on managing the country and just say that you're going to work with whoever is elected. Leave the elections to the American. Number one. Number two, don't make a big deal about this Team Canada. This sounds so hokey. Just do it. Just do the relationships. It's one-on-one. And really, so far, this government has been, David, forgive me for saying that, but historically has been more comfortable with the Democratic side. We need to sit down, develop personal relationship with MAGA folks. And they're not as bad as we all think. And they're not as anti-Canada as we all think. Believe me, I know them. I'm in touch with them. They have a really, are very well predisposed to Canada. And there is a lot that we can do. And there, I totally agree. I come back with what David has said. Don't wait. It's relationships. Obviously, that's important. And that should be done quietly, not in the big way that it's being done this week. But also what David said is right. Come up with policy solutions and partnerships and mind our own house so that when whoever is elected, we don't just call to congratulate them. We call to congratulate them and say, look, we've heard what you said about this, and here's what we could do. Now, we're not going to align on all policy angles, but there's a long list of things that we could do even with the Trump administration. I think we can't afford to be passive. We have to let them come up with the ideas that we may or may not like. We've got to come up with the ideas and take it to them and be prepared to do so. So I'll end there, but as you can tell, I could go on.
No, thanks, Louise. And you've written on this as well. David, I'm going to come back to you because you talked about dealing with Representative Stefanik, and I know Gary's going to come to this. Prime Minister put the emphasis on trade and presumably borders part of that. But as you pointed out, there are other issues that the Americans are concerned about. Certainly my experience is the Americans put big emphasis on defense and security. Bluntly, they want us to do more. Then there's energy, environment, and climate, where we have shared interests. Shouldn't they be part of our advocacy?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And I'd just like to say, I completely agree with Louise. The fact of the matter is that, in 2016, when, some of the cabinet ministers were starting to go after Trump and assuming that Hillary was going to win and everything else, I said at a cabinet meeting at that time, button your lips, stop it, shut up. And I would say the same thing today. like this is not helpful to be, talk about or to try to make the opposition in Canada accuse them of being MAGA Republic. I mean, this is not going to win the election for them, and it's not helpful. So I totally endorse what you said. In terms of, the issues, there's no question whatsoever that, we have this laundry list whenever we want to go talk to the Americans, and it's all about our trade issues that we're concerned about. And we don't spend enough time, particularly on defense and security. And there's no question in my mind that we were able to get the steel and aluminum tariffs removed when Trump used Section 232, which was essentially to declare steel and aluminum from Canada as a national security threat. What we did was we leaned on the U.S. military leadership and the defense leadership and the security leadership. And I remember saying to many of them, if you really want to have us become a national security threat, you'll keep those tariffs on. And I know that they did weigh in on this issue and helped us on a trade issue. And so we cannot, and I would say today, the relationship and the strength of our reputation in those two areas is not the same as it was then. And we are seen to, and this is not just this government, this has been going on for some time, but the reality is Canada has not been seen in the United States as reliable and dependable a defense and security partner as we had in the past, and we've got to change that.
No, very much makes investment in things. Gary, the Prime Minister also talked about a multi-layered approach to different levels of government, bringing in business, bringing in labor, something you've always endorsed. As we go into this campaign, advice from you?
Well, I think using all those assets we have, we should. And I would add, it's not just going to happen. I don't like the word charm offensive. I also don't like putting your hand on the horn and campaigning against Trump. We don't want, as David just pointed out, we wouldn't want anybody interfering in our elections. And we should treat our American election contests in a similar way. I would include the governors and premiers. A lot of economic decisions are made in the states by governors. And of course, each governor has up to 2 senators in their states that have a lot to say about economic decisions in Washington. So don't just go to Washington. I would say our biggest weakness, and I think we've got to deal with it now, is our position on NATO. You mentioned John Manley. He's the one that used the term, when the bill comes, we head to the washroom. I remember the last time I heard that was Mike Harris talking to Jean Chrétien at a health meeting. Of course, Jean Chrétien flicked this away like a foreign object in a salad. But I digress. But I was at a meeting of about 2,000 legislators, elected people in Western Canada and Western United States, with David Jacobson and David Wilkins and I. And the biggest issue there was Trudeau promising to sign up to the 2% of NATO, and then going to another media outlet and say, I have no intent of following that. And, I would not wait to find out what's going to happen in November. This is the window to do it. And I do believe Canadians would support investments in military, particularly to protect the Arctic when our neighbor is Russia. So I think there is a public will to do that. You just got to get out and communicate. But I do not want to wait till after November to decide what we're going to do on NORAD, or NATO, rather. We should do it now.
Oh, NORAD fits into that very much as well. Joe, let me turn to you. I'm sure there's questions being posed from our audience.
Well, could I just add one thing here? Is that
Please,
what you're all talking about is how does Canada Trump-proof itself? And the onus is on Canada to do it for itself, right? Yeah. What can it do to strengthen its commitment to NATO? Bearing in mind that the U.S. may step back from NATO under a Trump administration. What can it do to strengthen the relations with state governments and Congress, which is needed. I think both the Canadians, the Europeans, the Japanese, all should be thinking about, we can't control what happens in the U.S. election, but we can prepare for a different world. And frankly, even if Biden gets reelected, some of this stuff is needed because, as Louise said, the underlying issues here, MAGA is not going to go away if Trump gets defeated. There's going to be 30 or 40% of the American public who share some of these views. And the Biden administration has to adapt to a new world too. And that new world includes a U.S. who can't continue to bear all of these burdens, who had a U.S. that has economic interests that it will defend. If that's, you want to call that protectionism or isolationism, fine. But I think it's inevitable that we're going to move in that direction. And so the question is, how does one adapt? And I think the suggestions that David and Gary and Louise have made are all part of preparing for that next future.
Oh, thanks. And I know you've written a good piece about what the Europeans need to do. Thanks for supplementing it. We'll link to that piece you wrote. Joe, I'll turn to you because I'm sure there's some questions in the audience. Why don't you give us a couple of the main ones?
For sure, Colin. And just keeping an eye on time here as well. I'm consolidating a few of the questions here because we've gotten quite a few. So to start off with, we have a question from CJAI fellow Roy Norton about the concept of divided government in the United States. So this regards the idea of, as we can probably remember, back in 2019, around the CUSMA negotiations, there was a divided government in the United States, and that was actually in some ways beneficial for Canada because it gave the Canadian negotiators a bit more leverage. So I suppose the question is, could a divided government in the United States potentially be beneficial for future negotiations?
Okay. Bruce, why don't you lead with that?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I think it depends on the issue. It depends on how that breaks out in terms of, say you have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. I think the bigger issue is one that Louise pointed to, which is a stalemated government leads at least some people to believe that we need a different form of government. And that's not good for Canada. It's not good for the United States. And so now we should acknowledge that Congress has had the least productive year in modern history in the last year, which is a real sign of stalemate. By the same token, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, they accomplished an enormous amount, more than anybody probably since FDR. But I think a lot of the frustration of American democracy can be attributed to the fact that nothing seems to get done. Only politics seems to get done. And I think that even if there are certain issues where Canada might benefit from divided government, and as you say, from history, there's some examples of this, I do worry that the broader issue of the future of American democracy is not it trend in a bad way, and that's not in Canada's self-interest.
Thanks.
If I can just jump in.
Please, go ahead, Louise.
Thank you, Roy, for that question, and great to have you ask it. I think it matters in this case for Canada because in this one case, in 2 years, 2026, we have the renewal of USMCA, CUSMA, and if the White House does not control Congress, it would make the renewal, I think, more likely because Congress, I have had members of Congress tell us that they feel that if it gets reopened, they get to jump in and they get to have a say and they get to have to provide the president with negotiating authority. However, the way it's drafted, David would know even more intimately than I. He was there. But the way it's drafted now, the president can just roll it over. If all three leaders agree, it gets rolled over. And so I think that if it's divided, we get a higher chance of rollover because the president is not going to want to open that Pandora's box with a Congress he doesn't control. So that's what I would add to that.
Thanks. Joe, next question.
Okay, I received a few questions about your slides, Bruce, and I think that the rest of the panelists could opine here as well. And this is on the U.S. deficit and how that impacts perceptions in the United States, I suppose, and in Canada about the health of the economy.
Bruce, the deficit.
Not an issue.
Not an issue. Thanks, Gary.
That's
all right.
Oh, sorry,
Should
Bruce, you're just muted.
Should be an issue.
Okay.
Should be an issue.
Sorry about that. If you ask the American people about the deficit, they're going to say this is a horrible thing. You know, people should be able to balance their family budget. They'd balance the national budget. There's no connection between those two issues. But in an average person's mind, that's how you operate, and so that's how the country should operate. You know, there is what we learn in public opinion is that human beings are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions at the same time. So they think that the national deficit's, oh, by the way, could you fund this or that? And cut my taxes in the process. And so I think that it's a talking point, especially for Republicans. But then when they govern, they don't seem to care about it. The debt increased dramatically under the Trump administration because of the tax cuts, or at least largely because of the tax cuts. And I think that it is true that there may be a reckoning moment at some point in the future. You know, the steady growth in the debt to GDP ratio, as Herb Stein, one of Nixon's advisors, once said, you know, if something can't go on forever, it won't go on forever. And so that is one of the issues we face. But I don't think, other than a good talking point for especially Republican candidates, which their listeners kind of cluck and say, oh, yes, you're right.
All right.
Price of bread.
One last question, Joe, and then I'm going to ask our esteemed group what they're reading and streaming. Please.
Yes,
Joe,
certainly. And just in the interest of time, I suppose we should quickly go through this last one. This one, I think, Ambassador Doer and David MacNaughton, you will both be able to opine on, as well as Louise if she has time. So what are the current initiatives to gain sort of exemptions to the sort of trend in Buy America policy in the United States, as was managed back in 2010?
All right. Well, dealing with Buy America, both Gary and David, please, why don't you start, David, on how you dealt with Buy America?
Well, I mean, you know, we tried to, first of all, we enlisted a lot of the provinces in the business community and everything else. And we, on occasion, would get the Americans' attention by saying, if you go ahead with that, we would regrettably have to, block the import of Kentucky bourbon or something like that. And so, I mean, that whole sentiment of Buy America is increasing. It's going to get more prevalent regardless of who wins. And, again, we just go back to what we said before, unless we are seen to be, reliable partners on more than just the economic front, then we are in danger of Buy America spreading. And I just watching U.S. football games, the number of ads where the companies are all saying, and it's made in America, it's just this is a tone and a thing that is going on at the present moment that we should be very much aware of.
Good advice. All right, my final question, I'm going to ask you to lead on this, Gary, is what are you streaming or reading these days?
Well, I just wanted to talk about Buy America. We actually had a lot of help from the unions, and we with the Buy America with Pelosi and Leo Gerard, the head of the steelworkers, to get a waiver on Buy America when Obama first got elected. And then we later on threatened to ban California wine. So we switched about 70 votes in California in the Congress to back off some of the provisions that were in Congress when Pelosi was speaker. So you got to, as David pointed out, you got to get your elbows up a bit. I'm reading a book about John Norquay. He is the first elected premier of Manitoba. I've just got the draft book written by Gerald Friesen. He was the first Indigenous premier in Canada. He had many positive arguments with John A. MacDonald and some very destructive ones of the CPR railway. But anybody interested in Canadian history, I'm plugging Gerald Friesen's book, John Norquay, The Honorable John Norquay. It's
Perfect.
a long book.
Gerald Friesen and John Norquay. There's a building named after him as well. Louise, what are you reading or
Yes.
streaming?
I'm reading General Petraeus' latest book on the evolution of warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And I'm just in the first few chapters, so I can't yet, recommend it. It's really dense, but it's fascinating to see how some things have completely changed and some things have not. But a big book, and I'll let you know.
All right, David, what are you reading or streaming?
Well, I just started a book, in this whole spirit of optimism and for the future, and it's called "Why Nations Fail" by James Robinson. It's tracing, why some countries actually have been very successful and against all odds, and why others who you think should be really successful have not. So I just thought kind of interesting for today's world.
Yes, well, we'll hope it doesn't have to have soon practical application. Bruce, you finish this off. What are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, actually, what I'm doing is I'm listening to a Great Courses series. I highly recommend the Great Courses. They're lectures by professors on before 1776 life in the American colonies.
All right, where it all began. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great lectures before 1776. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all. I hope you've enjoyed this CJAI webinar. We were joined today by Bruce Stokes, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. You'll find Bruce's presentation on the CJAI website, and we'll be broadcasting this session on a future Global Exchange podcast. We thank our strategic sponsors, Lockheed Martin Canada, General Dynamics, Irving Shipbuilding, Hanwha Defense, and Cenovus Energy for making this webinar possible. My thanks to our producer, Joe Colin, who also asked the questions. I'm Colin Robertson. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.